It's so staggering. The Albanese government doesn't seem to understand the consequences of what it's doing to our gas industry. And even Japan is now looking and saying, watch out. Now, the gas industry is actually huge for us. It's worth many billions a year. But to get that gas and that cash, we need big multinationals to risk incredible amounts of money to come here, explore and develop the resources. For instance, INPEX, Japanese company, had to invest $30 billion to develop a gas field off Western Australia with a gas pipe to Darwin, and then sent off in special ships. $30 billion, which it then had to back up with guaranteed supply contracts, especially to Japan, of course. Now, around Australia, similar stories. Huge investments. Takes years. And if you have a government that suddenly changes the rules and says, actually, I want that gas. I might even force you to break your contracts. And by the way, you know, we can't even tell you 3 months in advance whether we're going to do it to you or not. You do that, you could destroy future gas projects in this country. It's crazy, right? But it's exactly what this Albanese government is doing and more. I've never seen such an attack. One, it says, we don't really want fossil fuels long-term anyway. And in fact, it's gone and funded environmental activists, like the Environmental Defender's Office, to go and challenge gas developments with your money. Two, it tells these gas companies, we're going to force you to slash your climate emissions by 5% each year, or else, you know, fines or big taxes, or you got it, but expensive offsets. Three, it says, oh, and we're also, by the way, a bit short of cheaper gas for Australia, so we want to supply you to supply some here and at a cost that we determine, a capped cost. And now, as of April 1, the Albanese government says it can decide even just 3 months, every 3 months, it's going to decide whether to stop or limit exports of gas if the government thinks we're going to run a bit short here. Japan, which through things like that could lose its own energy security after investing so many billions here, is warning that its own energy security could now be at risk. And guess what? If gas companies stop investing in Australia, so could our energy security be destroyed long term. Joining me is energy expert Saul Kavonic of Credit Suisse. Saul, you know, I don't want to sound, it just sounds so improbable, so outrageous, but what the Albanese government is doing to gas projects, how serious is this really?
Well, I think we should be taking what we've heard from the Japanese companies and also particularly the Japanese government seriously. Now, the words you've highlighted there, that they're taking a keen interest and they're warning of unintended consequences, you know, that's about as sternly worded a public statement you'll ever get from a Japanese official or Japanese executive. You know, if I was to translate that to Australian, they're basically saying, what on earth is going on here? And do we need to be concerned? And this is, as you say, there's multiple fronts of attack here on the gas industry. You've got gas pricing policy, export controls, you have the government funding green activist litigation against its own regulator to stop, which has backlogged gas projects across the country. And we're looking at now PRT tax reforms and international tax reforms coming up over the coming months as well. And we need to keep in mind, you know, Australia fundamentally has worse rocks, higher costs and more green regulation than most other places you can invest in the world. Yet the big international investors have come here because it's a stable regulatory environment where a contract means a contract and they're not going to have the rules changed in them. And Australia's built that reputation over decades, but it can all be lost in the space of 1 year. And unfortunately, we may be heading in that direction. And once that reputation is lost, it can take decades to bring up again. And big investors like Japan, remember, they didn't just underpin our gas industry and our coal industry and our iron ore industry. They're also key to underpinning our future green industries in areas like hydrogen, lithium, and battery metals. And they don't make a distinction between a government which is breaking contracts in the gas sector and other sectors. This is going to provide a knock to Australia's entire investment reputation across our entire exports, and not just gas.
But so people will say, I mean, the government's saying, you know, look, this is Australian gas that we're talking about here. Australia's a bit short of it. Australia should come first. I mean, what's the counter-argument to that?
Well, I don't believe there's a counter-argument to it. It is Australia's gas and Australia should come first. And I don't think there's particularly much debate about that, including by gas producers themselves. I think the real question, first of all, is can Australians come first for gas if you've put the entire gas industry in terminal decline and then there's no gas available for anyone? And secondly, is in order to make gas come for Australians first, is it really necessary to tear up the rules of the entire gas market and break contracts? There are actually much more nuanced and finessed ways to address this to get the outcome we want, which is more gas available domestically. And I'm afraid that the current policy is actually likely to make gas availability for Australians worse rather than better. And we don't have to look past what we've seen in the last 2 months, where it's become even harder for domestic buyers in Australia to get hold of gas as a result of this policy than it was beforehand.
We're told that investments in some new gas projects have already been frozen because of all this. Is that already true?
The freeze we're seeing in gas projects is very real. We've seen public statements from the likes of Senex and Cooper Energy talking about a few of those projects, but frankly, Andrew, that's not what actually is of concern here to our market. It's the investment that's stopping, and it's happening silently. So particularly the big international companies who invest here, they could invest anywhere, right? And they're just dropping their investment now in Australia. They're not announcing it. They don't want to pick a fight. They're simply putting capital elsewhere. And you're seeing it happen in very nuanced ways. For example, they're now starting to treat Australia, when you look at the hurdle rates, the requirements they require for an investment and the returns, they're increasing those hurdle rates, more like treating Australia like a Venezuela and Argentina or the Middle East or Africa because of the sovereign risk here. And that results in less investment. And unfortunately, we are seeing it already. It's going to impact supply this year, but particularly next year. And particularly, it's going to impact the flexible capacity in gas supply that we need in winter when we have shortages in the electricity market, which then raises the risk of blackouts rising. We hopefully can get through this year, but 2024 is another story, and it could become quite a precarious situation for energy security across the east coast of Australia, which thankfully, Australia hasn't had to actually deal with before, but it also means we're not prepared for it. And I think that risk is now becoming increasingly acute.
Thank you for sounding the warning, Saul Kavonic. Really appreciate your time. I mean, seriously, I can't believe the vandalism being done to this country by people who seem so arrogant and full of global warming religion. I mean, it's just, anyway, we'll feel it in a couple of years and then fingers will be pointed.